Good morning, everyone. Call the meeting to order. Today is Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024. It is 10:09. Commission Secretary, please call the roll.
Chairman Eckert.
Here.
Commissioner Boatright.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Erdman.
Here.
Commissioner Hagan.
Here.
Commissioner Slade.
Here.
Yes.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. As we move forward with our workshop, I have a friendly reminder for all that we are live streaming our open meetings for the public to view from their home or office. If you are speaking, please make sure you speak into a microphone and that the microphone is on so that viewers may hear what is being said. We're going to start our meeting this morning with a brief safety emphasis. Michael White, Assistant Safety and Emergency Management Director, is going to share with us what we need to do in case of emergency today.
Good morning, Commissioners and Director McKenna. In the event of a fire, the Commission Director and Commission Secretary will exit the rear of the room and out the back door in the conference room 101 to the sidewalk on Jefferson Street. The audience will exit through the doors to the lobby and out the back building entrance by the loading dock. Then we'll proceed to the sidewalk on Jefferson Street. An alternate exit is down the stairs out through the main entrance. Please walk up the hill on Jefferson Street to make sure that we all have the ability to have safely exit the building and parking lot and a safe distance from the building and emergency response vehicles. In the case there's a small fire, there's an extinguisher in the rear corner of the room by the AV podium. I've asked Eric Schrader to retrieve and use the fire extinguisher if needed. In the event of severe weather, everyone should head to the center stairwell and go down as far as possible in the interior of the building. If we must evacuate this room, please take a moment to make sure that who you're sitting next to, and make sure that upon your arrival to the designated safe location, that your neighbor has arrived also. If there's a medical emergency, most people in this room are CPR certified. Almeida will call 911 and direct emergency responders to our location at 105 West Capitol Avenue. I volunteered to administer CPR, and Jessica will assist me if necessary. There's an AED in the hallway on this floor across the conference room 103, and Scott will retrieve the AED in the event of a medical emergency. Now that we've discussed how to keep ourselves safe during our meeting, we'd like to provide an additional safety idea for you to take home with you. It's severe weather season in Missouri, and our weather last night certainly showed that it can be active. The months of April through June are our most active in Missouri. You may receive National Weather Service alerts for watches and warnings from a phone app, their website, and social media. But many people don't understand the difference between a watch and a warning. And a simple way that we suggest to remember this is during a watch, you have time. But during a warning, you need to take immediate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. All right. Yeah, it's on.
It is on the work.
It wasn't earlier.
Okay.
Okay, let's get started with the workshop today. I believe we have several staff lined up to speak today. And Patrick, I think you're going to start. So welcome, Patrick.
That's right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. I just want to start by thanking the team for putting the information together and also for the commission for kind of requesting this. This is the second in a series of orientations, but I think it really is important to step back on occasion and review just for certainly for newer members of the commission, but even the exercise of going through it on the staff basis is important. There is a solid basis for the business that we do and the business that we're in. It comes from commission policy that has been established over, and developed and modified as needed over the 100-year history of the commission. The department executes commission policy, and I really think in some cases there are none more important in terms of the kind of the capital programming and the resource availability for the organization than the ones we're going to talk about today. The financial forecast and our allocation formulas for the capital program. I happen to believe that this process that really started in earnest back in 2003 by commission action is one of the most significant reasons why in the past 10 years, as we demonstrated and reported and brought forward to you a summary of the 10-year capital results, meaning all completed projects from 2014 to 2023. The results of 4,206 completed projects, $11.1 billion programmed, but coming in $536 million under budget and 94% on time. The reason for that ability to have results, and those are through lean times, those are through challenging times, and those are through some headier times with resources, but also dealing with things like inflationary periods. There are a couple inflationary periods in there. It is the manner that the commission's policy enables the department to plan their work in capital improvements that impact communities and affect travel. That planning process is vital, but it also brings into bear the local communities that we serve so that they can rightly be the foundational piece of that. But the work that goes in to the execution of the capital plan is substantial, and the resources that we allocate are done based on objective criteria, and those criteria are updated every year. We'll go into that as we go, but I think that's a really important piece that a lot of people don't realize, because we don't just decide where the money goes. It is executing the commission policy, and it is complicated, but it is worth us stepping through that every year, and each and every year we do it. Now, because of the way the capital planning lead time works, the commission, in its wisdom over the years, has given the department the ability to hold on commitments for construction. And the commission has resisted the urge to break into those commitments over a kind of a rolling 3-year period. We update the capital plan on a 5-year basis, but we allocate resources to be fiscally constrained, which gives us coverage for federal requirements, but it's also just good business practice. We estimate revenues for a 3-year period, and we plan for the execution of all of that funding that flows through our formulas into the capital program, and we publish that each and every year. It's a commitment to completing construction. It's a risk-based assessment because all the revenue hasn't been collected yet, but it's our best estimate of the revenue as it's coming in. Fortunately, most of the time, transportation revenue is steady and predictable, but that's not always the case. And that commitment also means that if new needs come up, or if there is a desire to change the formulaic construction through the policy, the only way to change that is to have the patience to put that into year 4, because that's the only time when new money becomes available. We estimate and program 100% of estimated revenues for the first 3 years and about 50% for year 4 and 5. That gives us the ability to adjust for inflation if that's the case, but it also gives the commission the ability to make modifications. And we have made substantial modifications over the years, but they're planned out, they're placed out in the future, and then we can plan for that accordingly as well. And we'll step through a couple of those changes that have occurred. The rolling policy on the funding distribution is a matter of amendment, and you see the original funding distribution dates back to 2003, but there have been amendments, probably 8 or 10 substantial amendments to that over the years. Those are debated, they're discussed in public, and then we proceed once there's agreement. So I just think this is really the heart of commission collective wisdom over 100 years to come to this point. And it's why, even with constrained resources, this enterprise is a project development, I would say, juggernaut. And it's the good work of our people that execute the plan, but it really starts with the basis of the policy construct itself that gives us the wherewithal to do that. So I really do appreciate the structure that's in place and the consideration that's given. The first piece that we'll go into is the financial, kind of the financial summary and our financial forecast summary. So the first element here is really the timeline. So if you look at it, our kind of financial planning timeline to work our way through from a financial forecast to essentially a fiscal year where the budget starts. So we have the commission policy that we work on, but then we also have to work our way through the state budget process. That's about an 18-month process. So, we start in January with a financial forecast, and that is really an estimate of revenues that are coming in, and then it's a collection of funding needs against those revenues. And we work with our divisions and districts to collect those funding needs. We look at the capital planning that's out there, and we work through that. So over the course, when we do the financial forecast, then we work, once you've seen that financial forecast, which is 18 months before it goes into effect, and we do it over a multi-year period. We're not just trying to fund a single fiscal year period because we're planning capital over a multi-year period. So we estimate that going forward. Working with districts and divisions, we gather that information. We provide information. We'll get into the kind of the allocation to capital as a separate item next. But from February through May or June, we've got all the information back in. Financial Services Division compiles that, and then we bring forward our appropriations submission in the August timeframe, and that's a budget that's approved by the commission, and then the appropriations submission through the state's process commences with submittal to the governor's office by October 1 of each year. And then from October 1, we go through the legislative process all the way through June, May when the session is over. If there are any modifications made by the General Assembly, that's brought before the commission for amendment or adjustment in the budget. And then obviously the fiscal year starts in July. So there's an 18-month window that we go through, and we're always in some type of process with that going forward. But the Financial Services Division is really responsible for this. They're good at what they do. They do a really good job of estimating revenue, as you see through the reports that come through. Typically within 0.5% of estimated revenue is where we are. So the forecast and the modeling that's done proves that there is some stability to the revenue, but also that our team does a very good job of that estimation. So what you have in your backup is that financial forecast. So when we're putting that forecast together, we start with the current fiscal year and how that's being executed, and then we project out for the entire STIP period, so a 5-year window, and then essentially 1 year beyond it. So what we're trying to do in the forecast, again, is estimate revenues, estimate expenditures, look at the combination of operating and capital, and then see where we end up at the end of each fiscal year on an estimated basis. And we try to maximize the use of resources for construction output, so contractor awards. This is a very carefully watched estimation process by contractors. It's the business they're in, of course. They want to be able to project what we see financially so that they can determine the level of risk that they take. And then what we're also trying to do is balance to make sure that we've allocated enough resources to maximize the draw of federal funds, which is really one of the primary sources of resource for the organization. And then also to deal with the operating needs of the system. And I will say that this process itself, where we are initially maximizing that federal draw and also maximizing the construction output in a system that is certainly in need of repair and replacement, Those things put pressure on the operating budget because ultimately all the money, with some exception that we'll go through, really rolls through the state road fund. And that's the fund that the commission has fiduciary oversight of. So what we try to present is a reasonable execution and use of those funds, a reasonable level of risk being taken, and a maximization of construction output. To give you a little historic context, when I joined the organization, we had, and this is frequently discussed, what's the balance in the state road fund? Because a lot of times people look at a checkbook balance, if you will, and not really understand what the commitments are calling against that and think that, well, we don't need to either appropriate it into the fund or consider future revenues because there is money and there is significant resources. It's just not scaled for the needs of the system. But when we looked at how things were kind of put together, the risk profile of the organization, the outlook for revenue, the outlook at the federal level, we were taking very little risk. So we had, about an $800 million balance. And if we looked at the flow through at that time back in the 2015, 2016 period, the estimated construction award output was about 1.6 billion, kind of total capital program, including engineering and right-of-way and consultant work, over 2 billion. But that construction output, the awards themselves, so about a 2-to-1. If you look at that now, whether that's correct, whether that's incorrect, really not making a statement on that. But if you look at where we are today, we're running about $1 billion balance. It's getting up a little higher than that because more revenue is coming in. But we have construction commitments of 14 billion. So from 2-to-1 to 14-to-1. So we are taking significant risk. We think it's reasonable risk. And we have, in some cases, we have dedicated funding, very significant dedicated funding specified for particular projects like I-70 with the extraordinary investments made by the General Assembly and the governor in the last few years. So some of that is very much a known quantity, and so there's really no risk there. But even if you look at it on a $1 billion to 10 billion on the baseline, we have really amped up the construction output, and there is certainly a basis for that with increased revenues from the gas tax picking up and increases in the federal program. But we've also taken actions along the way, even through the funding allocation, where we've recognized certain programs that were popular in the state but had been defunded a long time ago by the federal government. We ended those allocations. Those were difficult decisions to make, but not that difficult because we weren't actually drawing federal money in for those. We were creating a liability on the state portion of the road fund, and working through that and more aligning our program to the way the federal program works and to have that happen quickly gives us an ability to take more risk in the road fund because we don't have this kind of unfunded liability building that had been the case with programs like Small Urban STP and a couple others. We made those changes when we made them against commission policy, and then we executed those policies gradually over a multi-year period so that projects that had been thought of and considered and committed to at the local level were still able to be executed. We just eliminated that. We've also done a lot of work to reduce debt, to pay down over multiple issues in the last several years. We have paid down debt, which was advantageous at the time based on the interest rates and the availability of resources. But every time you do that, you're making a choice not to build something. You're trying to put the financial picture in a position to be in a better position going forward. So again, we've got, in your background, you have this information. We do have the financial operating budget commission policy in your background here, kind of stepping through that. We then have the budget itself and how it's constructed. And And then we have really several documents that they're part of our annual report, but they provide good information about the revenue outlook, about the debt structure, about the allocation of resources at the county level. So we're tracking a lot of information. These we find are pretty instructive going forward. But if you'd like, we can step through those documents. But I wanted to stop. I see we have a question. Happy to respond to questions as we go.
Any questions? Commissioner Hegman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I looked through the document. I've got one question right now. I'm not limiting myself. It is, well, let's see what page number. It is 8 of 104. It's fiscal year 2021 to 2023 summary and fiscal year 2024 budget. Guess I'm asking, what's the difference at the bottom line? It goes from 3.5 billion to 7.1 billion. Is that all the general revenue that's been added in that makes a difference there? Or why did it basically go up?
Yeah.
Why did it double in that 1 year period?
Yeah. The primary item there is the application of
2.8 for the
2.8 billion.
I-70? Okay.
Yeah, and there
Okay.
was another $249 million added for other projects, including
Okay.
$100 million for low volume roads.
Right.
And then what you're seeing also is kind of a reflection of the estimated contractor awards. So when you look at the totality, it just depends on our schedule for construction as to when those when it actually happens. You see it starts coming down pretty dramatically.
Right.
But even in the, when we look at, and let me see if I can pull the one that I look at frequently when I consider that as earlier on. Sorry, this is a lot of.
Well, I think you pretty well
documents.
answered, Mr. Director. I think you answered my question. It really is just the additional
Yeah.
general revenue that really inflated it. Normally, we would be dealing with somewhere around a $3 billion
That's right.
annual budget
That's right.
without those enhancements and welcomed and appreciated enhancements from the General Assembly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
That's the first question. Thank you.
Anything further? Maybe it'd be good to kind of step through the financial snapshot. Because again, this is, I wouldn't consider this a financial, it's not a financial statement. It's more supplemental information that we found very helpful both internally and in working with policymakers. And Brenda Morris will kind of walk us through the basis, what is in the financial snapshot, and just kind of run from there. Certainly any questions you have. And this is an internal document. We have certainly the ability when we receive questions, just like we do in the Citizens Guide, if they become, matters that are their common questions, we actually try to pull the information together, create a report for it, and then publish it this way. And that is really helpful as we're answering questions. But, we also try to anticipate questions and provide the information up front. So, Brenda?
Certainly. Brenda Morris, Chief Financial Officer. So kind of to give you a little bit of perspective before I walk specifically through the financial snapshot. This is our annual comprehensive financial report. It is required by state law, and it is very technical. There are a few places in it that you could read and get a sense, but it is hard to digest in general. I think Commissioner Hegeman agrees. So we also have the Citizens Guide, which is an educational tool, and it is very easy to understand, doesn't have a lot of detail. It's a very high level view. And we found that there was kind of an in-between need, which the financial snapshot fulfills. It is part of the annual accountability report. And in it, you have information such as 5 years of historical revenue and expenditure information, including including that information that those revenues that get passed on to cities and counties. If you move through it, you also have a listing of all of our funds. So we talk about the state road fund a lot, but we have a whole slew of funds that we spend from that are appropriated for are established for specific and dedicated purposes. And so we list those out in the financial snapshot. It provides an overview of the federal funding for 10 years and by program for 5 years to give you an understanding of what historically we've received from federal funding and how much federal revenue we give in versus what we get back. That is provided in here. It gives an overview of the bonding program. So Director McKenna talked about how we have made efforts in reducing our debt service and reducing the amount of outstanding bonds. We do provide a general overview of our bonding program and what we've done in the past. We also provide the highway user fees that go to local entities because part of the motor fuel revenue, motor vehicle sales tax, and motor vehicle and driver's license fees, part of that gets distributed to cities and counties. It's part of their revenue stream. So we provide that information. Some addition that is very helpful that we've made in the last couple of years is breaking out our expenditures for how much goes outside the department and how much we're spending internally. That is included in here. Another addition that was made just in the last few years is a summary by district, by county of the expenditures we are making in those counties and the revenue that we collect in those counties. That's kind of useful information. People find that very useful.
And that's a combination of operating and capital. So the labor, equipment, and supplies that we use, say, in a snowstorm, that all gets allocated out as we're going. Any of the other operating work that we do through our maintenance forces as well. So it's a combination of both.
That is correct. Then you go and we show it's a 10-year history on contractor awards and contractor payments, and then that forward look for those 5 years of the next 5 years, just to see. And, as Director McKenna talked about, those have increased dramatically over the last several years, and you can see that in that chart. We also provide a history of the motor fuel tax rates, which is a good place. We often get questions. A lot of what is in the financial snapshot has come out from what questions are we getting? What kind of detailed type questions are we getting about our funding? So there is a variety of transportation facts. Then there is a section that folks have used to look at various revenue options. So what would a 5-cent increase in the gas excise tax, how much would that generate? So rather than having everybody try to do their own calculations, we put those in the financial snapshot so that policymakers have a place to go to look at that information. And lastly, one of the charts that I often refer to, and I know that I often share with others, in the last chart in the book is a funding flow chart. And it kind of shows the various state revenue sources and where they get deposited and how they come into the state road fund or to the state road bond fund and so forth. And I would be glad to answer any questions related to any of the documents that we put together to demonstrate.
Anybody have any questions for Brenda?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay, so we've got a question on page 41 of 104. We're talking about kind of the allocation process, it looks like. And then talking about the remaining funds available for road and bridge improvements. Fiscal year 2022 allocated 29 million for safety projects, distributed 27 on a 3-year basis. Serious injuries, so you do take the serious injuries is how you, in the various areas, is how you allocate those funds?
When, that's the
That's the
section
next
we're
section.
just about to get into.
Oh, I'm too
Yep.
early.
So
Well, then I'll
this one,
wait.
we will,
Never mind.
if we can hold that for just a second.
I'll be glad to
Thank
answer
you.
any other questions. Or I'll phone a friend on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of the,
Okay, so now this is page 33 of 104. Alternative fuel decals. Now I may have an interest in that. So what I've told folks is, when I hear the complaint that these electric vehicles aren't paying for their use on the roadways, my understanding that these fuel decals have been designed to basically be the equivalent of a gas tax on the electric vehicles. Is that a fair illustration of what the alternative fuel decals actually does? I mean, that's the way it was presented to me at one time.
it is.
I have presented it. Am I accurate in that description?
The intention is that there is some degree of user fee basis for access and use of the system, and they do have that effect. They do not approximate the revenue that comes in
They do not.
from a typical vehicle, depending on the fuel economy of the vehicle. So
Well,
we,
sure.
but I think from a public policy perspective, it's a good first step, right? It is at least acknowledging that there is some use. When SB 262 was passed, increasing the motor fuel user fee, there was an additional provision that actually raised the decal
Decal
from
fee,
$75 over a 5-year period to $150. So it's doubling it over that period of time. Now, the typical, both the state and the federal money that comes in from an average driver using motor fuel is probably 3 times that. So it's not the equivalent, but it's a start.
So there's some room.
There is some room.
If we wanted to make it equivalent, there'd be some room on that to move forward.
That's correct.
And these alternative fuel decal fees, do they go into the state road fund?
They do.
They do. Okay, so
Yeah.
not one of the other.
We,
aspects.
a few years ago, there was a legislatively appointed commission or task force that was created, the 21st Century Transportation Task Force. And in that, there were some, there were, I think, about 25 people that were appointed to that, legislators, agency officials, members of the public, and we toured the state. We had about 20 public meetings. We drew a lot of information in, and that was one of the issues. How do we deal with this convergence that's going on?
Right.
The findings of that task force said, while electric vehicles and hybrids are kind of that future state, over the near term, the more significant impact is the rising fuel economy of the average vehicle. So somebody replaces a 10-year-old pickup truck, it's probably 30 to 40% more fuel efficient today than what they had. That means we receive less revenue per mile driven, and that's happening, on a network basis. So even though we have mileage that's increasing, the revenues are pretty flat, and we project in our financial model that starts to taper even after the effect of the increase in the motor fuel tax. So we came up with a policy companion to that, which we called the kind of transportation equity for all Missourians. And it was a registration fee.
Okay.
So rather than going to, say, a vehicle miles traveled where what people don't understand is we don't collect the fuel tax at the retail level. It's done at the wholesale distributor. So nationwide, that's about 1,100 locations, but there are 300 million drivers. We're not going out and reaching to each retail transaction. In Missouri, there are about 22 wholesale distributors of fuel. So Department of Revenue, it's a simple task. They go out and they get that information. They charge the excise fee, and that's done on a broad basis. If one of the challenges with a VMT is you actually then have to go to every vehicle owner and collect information about their use and all of that. That's complicated, and it's going to be costly to
Yeah.
develop the systems to do it. Not a bad idea, but it's costly, and it costs very little to collect the revenue now. So we thought if we just did something on average, the average user, and we scaled it based on the fuel economy of the vehicle in 10 mile per gallon increments. So there were like 6 different fees. And once you get up to, say, 60 miles per gallon, which is going to put you in the advanced hybrids, and then the electric vehicles that aren't drawing any motor fuel, you'd be paying a registration fee that would be the equivalent of what we pull in from somebody driving 20 mile per hour pickup truck or an older vehicle. And all it did was create a counterbalance. You either pay the gas tax or you pay the registration fee. On average, pretty simple.
Yeah.
And then you just have to establish a mechanism to give people the ability to space out that payment over the year, rather than asking somebody to have to pay the whole thing up front or in arrears, but all at once. So it was an interesting idea. It never got any policy legs, but we have had some conversations with some in the legislature that would like to renew that conversation, as a look forward issue. But it's a great point.
Yeah.
The General Assembly has done some good work on this already. It just isn't an equivalent yet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other?
Any other questions?
So the second piece of this is really then taking that information from the financial forecast, which, and then the additional information as Brenda described it, and working it through our financial planning model that establishes the targets for our districts for the allocation of money to capital. So really the first piece here, and this is what I referenced when I opened up, is the statewide transportation improvement program funding allocation policy, the commission policy. And this policy was established in 2003. There are a lot of good reasons for it, but effectively what this did a better job of organizing the relative information and using objective criteria to allocate funds. Again, there is and there continues, and I think there will always be a matter of debate as to which items belong in that allocation, because we know that anyone can pick an allocation that would steer funding their way relative to others. However, I think the main point is that the commission has selected criteria, and those criteria are how we distribute the money. But this policy, the entire policy, is the language of a financial formula. That's what this is, because you can see we start off with the first thing we do is we deduct federally suballocated pass-through funds designated for specific purposes. So what we're trying to do is move from mandatory to discretionary. And it's that discretionary pot of funds that then get allocated to districts for the build of the capital program. Eric is here and Ed is here as well. Two gentlemen that have been through the entire build of this and have seen, even from the way that it was done in the past, which was far more discretionary on the part of allocation and project selection on the part of the department than what happens today. And then, just looking at needs and maybe even the ability of, one region or another to advocate for those needs relative to another might have steered funds in a way that was not objective. And the point is, to take as much subjectivity out of the process and have objective criteria for allocation of revenue. Whether or not it's enough to fill the needs, that is also a matter of discussion and debate. But the point here is this is a fairly complicated formula. It's a fairly complicated policy, but it gives us a prescribed formula that we follow each and every year. And that's its main importance, I think. And then should circumstances warrant in the future, or should a commission decide that something is amiss or wants to steer us in a different direction gradually, because we can still run through our commitments and still make modifications, then this is the place where it happens. And these are the discussions. So again, having the opportunity to kind of step through this and show you what is the formula, how does it work, and this is a commission policy and is at the commission's discretion to modify or update or eliminate if that was the desire of the commission. The simple fact remains that we would not produce nearly as much construction output for the dollars that we have relative to DOTs elsewhere in the country without the guidance of this particular policy. I think this is the most critical from a construction output, which is what most people think of MoDOT about from a budgetary perspective. This is the key, and it is really, I happen to believe it's the finest example of distribution of funds that I have ever seen in the public domain. I've never seen anything like this at the federal or at a state level, and it is the singular reason why our planning process works and we get construction done, not just talked about but done. So kind of walking through that. Ed, did you want to give a little background, and then we'll go to Eric?
A little context. So, I think this didn't just kind of appear. This was evolved over a decade. In the mid 90s, we were not delivering. The department was not. There was a lot of turmoil around the state, and I think the commission at that time said we have got to do something to change our trajectory. So throughout the 90s and into when it was finally adopted, there was a lot of work. There was a lot of work with MPOs, with RPCs, with stakeholders, with commissions, because there were several commissions in that time frame, and it kind of evolved into what you see today is the funding formula. And I will say that there are a couple people in the room that were like primary people that worked really hard on that. Paula Goff was a district planner at the time when we were developing this, and Michelle is probably, I would say, the primary architect of the final outcome of what we use as the planning framework and the funding distribution. So a lot of people did a lot of work to make this happen, but I would say, prior to this, districts would bring their needs to somebody that sat in my chair and the planning director, and somebody would allocate money, right? It would be, well, let's do this and let's do that. It wasn't like it was, there was a thought process to it, but the problem was there wasn't any certainty and there wasn't any, really accountability to the process. And so I think what it really did, it allowed us to actually put more accountability on our program teams to deliver projects. It gave them a view down the road of some certainty that they could count on. And that really turned the tide for us to be able to become an organization that delivered year in, year out, the certainty of our project teams knowing that the money was there and knowing that we were going to hold them, the commission was going to hold them accountable to deliver the projects that were in the STIP. And then I think the commission saying these are commitments and we're not going to waver from that also gave our project teams the certainty that they weren't just working for no reason. I think that was really important. And it really also, we put some real accountability expectations on our program delivery team as it related to not only project development, but also delivery of the construction project. And I agree with the director that without that, we would not deliver at the rate we do today. So just with that as some background, I'll turn it over to Eric to walk through the nuts and bolts.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, I think to build on that a little bit, MoDOT in our recent history has been recognized in the top 5 in the nation in efficiency of delivering projects. And there's really 3 things that drive that. And this is one part. You know, the one part is we have great people. We got a great team. You know, if we're choosing upsides anywhere, I'm sticking with the team I got. The second piece is the planning framework and the planning process. We do not encounter some of the derailing events of lawsuits and public consternation about projects that many others do because we involve so early in the process at that local level. That avoids a lot of that frustration. But then having this part of the funding, the predictability of it, because transportation projects are multiple years to develop and deliver, and having that consistency and predictability is also what leads to that, some of that efficiency. You don't get the fits and starts where you may go a long distance on a project that never comes about. In this case, when we start a project, we know it's a commitment and we're going to the finish line. So
And you
it's that
know,
efficiency.
in that as well, you see from this organization very specific, anything that affects our revenue, anything that affects our budget, we get very, very concerned about, big or small, because we've already made the commitments in projects. And that's why it's so vital. And a lot of people will look at that saying, well, what difference does it make? It's just a little bit of money here or there. But it makes a big difference, because if something that we have estimated doesn't come true, we are literally at risk of not fulfilling a construction commitment. So that's why it takes on significance, because it's not just that one item in a budget. It may carry forward and compound for multiple years and really impact our ability to fulfill that commitment and keep the planning process rolling. And that's because people will think that, oh, you've got it in your STIP already. You already have the money. Well, we typically have about 20% of the money or less in what we've committed.
Yeah, to give you some idea, right now there's about $4 billion under contract for construction. And as the director said, there's only $1 billion or only $1 billion in the bank, so every 2 weeks we're processing payment to contractors, but our obligation that is out there is approaching $4 billion right now. The other thing I want to start off with is we also talk about, this is a combination of local funds, federal funds, state funds, and we often use term just federal funds, but federal funds comes in. So I'll bring this to an engineering's financial level. It comes in several flavors. So there's different programs and different requirements and different eligibilities that all have to be taken into account. And the same thing with our system. So all of our bridges are eligible for federal funding, but not all of our roads are. So it's important, it adds to the complexity of this.
So we, Mr. Chairman, may I ask a
Yeah.
question?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So all the bridges, so even the gravel bridges,
And
because through the BRO program?
through the BRO program.
So, okay.
All the publicly owned bridges in Missouri.
But not
are-
necessarily the roadways.
But not the roadways.
Okay, I guess I've known that, I just never recognized that before,
But for
yeah.
us, that's about 10,000 lane miles that is not eligible for federal funds.
Lettered routes,
So
are they
it's-
typically, their bridges would be
their bridges are but
covered, but the letter routes,
many
low
of the
volume
routes
roads are not?
Yes.
We have more miles of roads ineligible for federal funds here than the entire system I managed in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
It's kind of to give you some scale. It's
You
bigger
go
than
back
an
to-
entire
Go back to
state.
23 and ask Farm Bureau why we did that.
That's right.
1923. Which kind of brings me, so that, what is designated as the national highway system as compared to the other thing? So I assume we get matches for the national highway system.
Correct.
Are the numbered routes
Number
part of the
one,
national?
generally they are. So
Okay,
actually so we talk about majors, minors, and low volume.
right, yeah,
In the federal system, it's actually about 7 categories.
okay.
So there's more descriptions. We pull them together that determine eligibility at federal level. basically what it comes down to is local roads are not eligible for
Right.
federal funding.
Right.
And as you work your way up the system to distributors and collectors and interstates, then each of those become eligible.
So some of the numbered routes are eligible, but not all of them, because there's some of them are at low volume. I mean, there's low volume numbered routes out
But
there.
there's parts of the national system that do have a lower volume, not, but they are eligible.
But the numbered routes are part of the national
Because
system.
it's based on how the road functions, it's not just simply a volume calculation.
Okay. Okay.
And we have some low-volume roads that are on the national highway.
Yes, we
system,
do.
Just not all of them.
Just
That's
not
right.
all.
That's
Oh,
right.
we do.
So it's
Well,
not,
that's interesting.
it's
Okay.
one of those things, you're absolutely correct. It's not an absolute. It depends on how the road functions and the combination of knowledge and the use of it.
Yeah, and it's not a statement of ownership, whether it's the state level or the local level. It is truly how the road functions, not its volume and not its ownership.
It's just that a higher percentage of those that aren't on the national highway system are in northern Missouri.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
70.
Yeah.
Good question. Appreciate it.
You'll probably get more questions.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Appreciate that. So I'll walk you through this. So what I want you to keep in mind were some of those factors, but there are things that we take off the top before the money is distributed to the districts. And I'll walk you through some of those. And the first group are ones that we administer. We become the federal administration part of it, but the money actually flows to other areas. So the bridge off system. So those are bridges we don't own. Those are typically cities and counties, but we administer those funds and have all the obligation to do that. So we take that off before this. The large urban surface transportation. So there are federal funds dedicated to urban roads.
So I realize this deduction. So before these deductions take place, we've already taken out for highway patrol and cities and counties.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes. That's
Debt
great point.
service and the operating budget.
Okay.
So this is then the next, the next step.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Chairman, this may be the time to ask this next question. Ma'am?
Go ahead.
Ask a question, yeah. Okay, so when you talk about the operating budget, there's a MoDOT asset management plan. Now, is that typically the plan that allocates just the maintenance and upkeep? Is that operating budget? Is that inclusive of?
It's a combination.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I guess my question, what is MoDOT's asset management
So we'll
plan?
get to
I've
that.
seen that term in a long time,
Mhm.
and
When I
I
come-
don't know that I've ever
when I
really
come to that
grasped it.
section, I'll
We-
go into detail.
Okay.
We
Thank
used to call that taking care of the system. So it's essentially working on what's already out there.
Right.
And making sure that we get the full useful life when we convert to asset management. You're trying to do enough work on it that you get the useful life out of the facility, and not less than that. So it
Right.
doesn't mean you can keep a bridge in good repair forever. It's just, if it was designed for 50 years, you should get 50 years out of it.
And that would be typically more operating costs as compared to capital costs? Or
We use
it's-
both to achieve
It's
it.
both, okay. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think you're looking at kind of an accounting designation. Does
Yeah,
it
I am.
extend the useful life, and therefore is it a capital expenditure? The way we break this down in the state budget, you have your operating expenses are essentially your employment expenses, your our maintenance forces that are
Right, yeah.
doing the work, our equipment purchases, that sort, and then everything that goes into our capital program being defined as a statewide transportation improvement program, moves into our STIP allocation formula here. And we could have, by accounting definition, both operating and capital expenditures within there, but it's not defined as operating budget in our budget. It's kind of what flows on the balance sheet. Did you increase the useful life? And in many cases, what we see is, we
Okay.
typically do that by about $1 billion a year, with everything being considered. And then the rest of it is literally just doing the preservation work to keep the assets in decent condition, not to necessarily expand them.
I think the
And that takes about 75% of our total kind of, if you look at our capital planning, the STIP, 75 to 80% of that is in that category,
Just
which many
maintaining
would
roads,
consider
yeah.
operating. But because it becomes a, say, resurfacing project, part of the allocation to a particular district, that is, part of the STIP, part of the allocation.
And as somewhat of a teaser, next month we'll report on road conditions, our
Yeah,
annual
thank
report
you.
on bridge and road conditions, and we'll go into some more detail behind that too.
I think that
Thank you.
it's gets confusing trying to the definition between the operating budget and asset management or
Yeah.
taking care of the system. Those get blurred.
It is,
Very
and
much.
even with the look on it's, why is there so little money available for expansion or for new facilities like new interchanges, that sort of thing? That's really the question. Once you take all the in the formula, all the things that we don't have discretion over, which is, as the chairman said, constitutional allocations to cities and counties off the top, to other agencies off the top, for debt service, that sort of thing. Then you get down to what's left. We've included an estimate of all federal funds, but then there are mandatory allocations to larger communities that is part of the formula. We take those off. Then you get down to, just what the core is for our use for preserving and improving the system. And the preservation of the system grows typically in typical inflation about 3% a year. But new construction can grow even faster than that. So when we look at asset management plans and we task our districts to maintain their assets, even when they're allocated funds, their first duty is to maintain the assets. And then after they've done that in their plan, then there is money available for system improvement, which would be really kind of the accounting definition of a capital expenditure. And that is a subset of, and a small subset of everything we do. And that becomes a point of frustration for communities and for policymakers, and for developers. But the commission has directed us over multiple commissions for multiple decades. And citizens have told us through long-range planning and surveying, the first task is to take care of what we have. And only then, and then sometimes we've gotten into areas where we've expanded more rapidly than our maintenance forces can keep up with. And we've been in that for a long period of time.
Great. No
Great
problem.
questions.
So I'll move on to, this next one is a federal, it's often referred to CMAQ. This is congestion air quality. This is where the federal bill also ties with the clean water and clean air bill. So there's federal funds that are specifically designated at 2 regions of our state to address air quality that comes off. Transportation alternatives. This is federal funds that used to be called non-motorized. This is where the federal fund provides for shared use paths, sidewalks, things of that nature, that also support biking and pedestrians as well. The recreational, go ahead.
Amtrak in that category?
No. Recreational, shorts, didn't mean to sound so curt there. Recreational Trails Program, this is another federal program. This actually goes through to Department of Natural Resources. They use this with parks and greenways. The next one is our multimodal operations. So this is aviation, rail, transit, and ports. We can't use the road fund for any of their activities. That's constitutionally excluded. And on the flip side, they have federal programs that are very specific to their activities as well. So we have to account for that money and make sure that those programs are set aside and those funds aren't distributed, because that's administered here locally. The other thing to note with that is all those activities, we don't own any of those. We own no airports, we own no rail, and we own no ports and no buses. We work as the federal administrator for all those funds that have responsibility for it, all the accounting, all the oversight, and all that, but we're not the actual owner. So it gets very complex very quick when you're doing that, working with some 250 different transit providers in the state and all of our airports and all the others. So that money comes off the top because it's not eligible to be distributed.
So we're the pass-through and auditing entities on those type of projects then?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We have no discretion.
Yeah.
They gave it to us.
Yeah, the federal, those are not optional.
Do we have option in how the funds are distributed? Or is that fairly cut and dry from the federal
We
government
do
as
have
well?
some, but a
Okay.
lot of
I
them
mean,
are, a lot of them are.
I assume
federal-
we're running them through formulas as well. but-
Yes, yes. There's a lot
but-
of federal
but-
guidance for those, for eligibility.
Yeah, so it's largely dictated by the federal government?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Some modest
Some,
discretion,
some modest.
not discretion or
Some that are unique to Missouri's
Okay.
setup than others.
interesting.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
typically eligibility.
commissioners,
No,
I
this is
find this
great.
stuff interesting, so.
This is-
This
is the purpose.
Right. This is
Thank
just how we
you.
hoped it would go.
I'm
Typically,
boring
the-
y'all to death, I'm sorry.
No,
You
no,
know, Commissioner Smith left, so I mean, yeah. Okay, thank you.
The typically the eligibilities are dictated to us. The timing and the selection, depending on whether, say, a transit provider brought forward a request for funding, that sort of thing. That we work through, and the timing of, say, airport improvements, that sort of thing that are eligible. So, we work with the owners on that.
Okay. So coming on down, the next one is, after that would be project financing, bond, making sure, good thing here that in the process here, it acknowledges we're going to make our debt payments before we distribute, funding. Then the next one is one that has changed over time. So as Ed mentioned,
What's Garvey bonds?
those are grant revenue anticipated.
Yep, it's federal. They are anticipations of future federal funds, and there is a capital market mechanism to borrow against future federal funds. I am not a huge fan of
Interesting.
these, but
It sounds like speculation to me, but
well,
okay.
I mean, they're well accepted in the capital markets,
Okay.
and they are considered very safe for bondholders. So they are a funding tool and a financing tool, and in certain circumstances they've been useful.
Thank you. Thank you,
Great
Director.
question. So this next one is one of the changes as we talked. This has changed over time. One of the questions with projects, we often talk about the construction. We bring you the construction contract cost, and people become very focused on, well, that's the cost of the project. Well, not really, right? Because there's engineering, there's right of way, there's utilities, and one of the questions in this is where do you account for the engineering cost? For the staff and everybody. Do we allocate that out, or do we? In this case, we made the change to make this clear that we pull this out so that when we're talking about the allocation of funds, we're talking about the allocation of funds to the project and not the engineering costs. This is the change over time.
This really helped us eliminate some of the confusion with contractors, because when we say this is the amount that flows through this formula and these are the contractor award amounts, we wanted that to be, that is actually what we're going to put out, so they can break that up into 12 and say we should expect X amount per month in the contract lettings. So this was a really good change, and it eliminated years, I think, of consternation there.
It always looked like you allocated more money that never made it out the door.
Right.
And it's like, well, where did it go? So it's a more transparent way to account for that part. The next one is some of those other federal funds and federal requirements, open container, transportation alternatives. These are federally specialized funds that we account for, that we take off and then use them, apply them, but we don't distribute them per se to the districts. The next one, though, is one that's also changed over time. This is the cost share program. And you'll see on there that the amount in 24 will grow up to 45 million. We take this is the commission's cost share program, sets it aside. We then put this out to all of the state of Missouri to bring us, this is where we try to leverage at least $1 for $1, sometimes more. But it's been a great asset. Now, in the last few years, it's gotten a little slower because there's just been a lot of other available funds out there. But this is a way that we somewhat can leverage the dollars and multiply them to do desired programs. This also allows people to somewhat step ahead in line right? When you bring us money, that's one thing that can move a project along quicker. This is one of those activities that allows for that expansion items that so many people desire.
And this had been suspended back in 2014 for concerns about lack of funding. We had a lot of discussions about that when we were trying to ramp back up. And so we had a ramp up period. That's why you see in this policy, 30 million. We actually started, 2016, I think we put 10 million in, then we went up to 25 for a couple of years. And this is the tail end of that, going up to what had been the previous allocation of 45 million a year. So this kind of brings us back to where we were. And again, whether or not we have full subscription of this just depends on what the availability of resources and project needs are around the state.
So the next one is where we account for specific funding for a project. So if a partner or local agency, we want to make sure that the earmarks or any of those type of things, or whether it's a special funding from the legislature, we make sure that that money goes to that specific project and doesn't work into the distribution formula. It will go out to whoever is the owner of that project.
And here's a specific, this step 7 is one where we should probably bring to you a refinement here, because we have typically, until the focus on bridge program, there had never been general revenue for road and bridge investment, right? So we say federal earmarked, and obviously we've got $2.8 billion for I-70. That is not part of the allocation or distribution either. We've done that because we believe that's the intent here, but we ought to refine this in a policy change so that it's clear.
So that money designated to a project makes it to that and doesn't go through the distribution somehow. That's the understanding of the intent, let's say. Next down is project savings and adjustments. So this is part of that accountability. And this is something unique to us. So places that have savings on projects, and up until the last 3 or 4 years when inflation went crazy, we consistently did, those savings go back to the region that had the savings. Now, on the flip side of that, the accountability part is when a project goes over, that region's accountable for the overage as well. Engineering parlance, we true up the books on a regular basis. So your savings will come back to you, but also your overage catches up with you as well as we do projects.
A good example of that is the overage on the low volume roads in the first year. We had $15 million overage. And that is working itself through in the future years.
The next one here is one that came into being more recently out of the history of this. This is the Asset Management Deficit Program. So this is the understanding of, we realized that on the similar types of roads, people were not having a similar experience. That low volume may be in a lot better shape in one part of the state than another. And that what the commission's understanding and commission activity was to direct some money to address that, to target it towards that specific activity. So this is where we formulaically set aside 25 million, then look at condition and assign those monies to the places that they need to be to help address that issue. And it's made a difference. And it works in over time. But this is a way that we do some of that to address that difference experience across the state that a region had. Now, the intent is once a region may receive this money once, but not need it next time. So this money moves around to where it's needed is kind of how I describe it. And it moves a little quicker than other funds because we're looking at those annual condition reports and trying to target money to where we can move the needle for condition.
Yeah, it's an official recognition that no matter what formulaic construction you have, the end results don't always play out the way you'd like. I mean, floods in a region or something else end up creating conditions that need to be addressed.
And when did that go into effect, actually? I remember
we put that in, I believe, in 2018 was part of when we did that. Is that correct, Pam? Might have been a little after that.
I think it was later than it.
Oh, 20.
We talked about it. It's one of those that came in that third year.
Oh, we have one like this on the operating side as well. That's a little bit older.
Right.
Yeah.
But formally in January 22.
Well, again, so this is an example. We set the policy change in 2018. It went into effect in 2021. So again, that's because if we set the policy change, took money off the top, and we already had allocated the money to projects, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So yeah, when it goes into effect, that 3 to 4 year cycle for any changes, it is a little frustrating, but it's how we fulfill the construction program commitments.
So now after those 9 things are accounted for, now we're talking what's available for projects across the state by region. The first step of that then is looking at safety. This is where our $29 million for safety, and 27 is distributed to the regions of the state. But specifically, we take that to target safety projects, right? So as we talk about things that are eligible, that's where some of this nature of the federal funds and some of our own, we specifically say this is going to target safety things.
We've increased that to 58.
Yeah.
Now starting
In 23.
In 25.
So
next fiscal year.
starting in 23, the change, the policy change was made in 2020. We made it in 2020, and it went into effect in 2023. Now, when we're programming on a 5-year basis, we've been able to kind of advance that program and work it. This was recognition that fatalities were rising, and the commission wanted to make not just a policy statement, but to put money specifically to
This is another one that's
countermeasures.
targeted results.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, do your best, is targeting specific results. And I think you'll see that as we go through a lot of this, it's targeted towards results. What do Missouri citizens get for this? So then after that, then we're talking about asset management, taking care of the system we have. So the way I'll describe our asset management plan, every road and every bridge, we take a 10-year look at what treatments need to be done in the next 10 years to that piece that we own and try to schedule that out. Now, the STIP doesn't go that far out, but we're in this for the long game. And also the conditions of payments change slowly as that glacier move, and the same thing with bridges. But to really be efficient at this, you need to take about a 10-year window and really have a thought of what's the targets, whether they're done by maintenance, whether it's a chip seal or pipe replacement or a 1-inch overlay, or is it, a bridge that needs complete replacement, or is it just washing and sealing the deck? So it's trying to take every piece of our huge asset and have a 10-year plan of what are the treatment it needs over the next 10 years and try to put numbers to that. So we use some typical cost of each of those types of treatments and then ask the districts to manage this. The districts assemble this, but this also guides how they use the STIP money for addressing that. And one of the things was, so where are you at on your asset management plan? Are you gaining so it's a longer game than just the first 3 years, but it's looking at when's that schedule? When should that fall? Because that's the repeatability. That's one of the great things that this funding formula gives. It gives you that predictability about the relative amount of funds. The asset management plan tells you also the relative timing of when you need to do certain activities. It also gives you the impact of if you don't, because there's some that we simply can't get to, don't have enough money, or things may change. So if you don't do it this year, then what? And that plays into what we'll talk about next month is what condition are the roadways in? Because one of the questions we get, so we have the 7th largest system in the nation, and we're still in the mid 40s on funding per mile. How do you do that? Well, it's great people that are doing this. They're sticking to asset management and having to say no to the next shiny new thing that somebody wants.
Well, in conditions in the high teens. So, relative to the dollars being allocated here, it's the dedication. This is probably the hardest thing we ask our districts to do, because we ask them to look beyond their funding right now to what the trends will be in conditions. So they can't just rush to the shiny object all the time. They have to stick to this. You have to stick with a pavement program and a replacement cycle, or you get way behind. I mean, we see that in areas where we've had very limited funding. low volume roads is a great example. I mean, you get behind and then you have a really big problem that keeps growing. We have this with bridges
Right.
because our bridge condition, we're in the top 5, or I guess bottom 5 in terms of the number of poor
Poor
condition bridges in the state. So that's one where the lack of funding really hits us.
So that leads in well to the next one. So we take major bridge money off right away here at this point and do that statewide. Now, we do that for a couple of reasons. One is that condition. So there's 200 bridges that we put in the major category. So that's a bridge over 1,000 feet long. That's our definition. Most of those are big river bridges, big interchanges, and big lake bridges. They're highly expensive to repair and really expensive to replace. And they have such a swing on the budget of a district. So I'll use the Champ Clark Bridge as an example up in the Northeast that we recently did on the Mississippi. So it's a shared bridge with Illinois, which is great. They pay half the cost, we pay half the cost, but each partner shares about $100 million. So the year that needed to be replaced, we could do that bridge in Northeast and nothing in all the other counties. Not a paving project, not a bridge project, not a single thing if we didn't do it this way. So it swings the number too much. We also know that we need to do about 2 of these bridges a year, right? Because there's 200 of them and about half of them are over 50 years old. And this is where our asset management plan comes in. That says you got to be doing about 2 of these a year or the wave's going to overtake you.
Well, so the couple things on that, even that notion of 2 a year, that's suggesting that we have a 100-year asset life, and we don't. So it's even a little bit more than that. But they weren't all built, 2 a year.
No.
So we had a big investment in the 1930s, and then a big investment post-war, 50s, 60s, that created incredible amount of bridges. But the point, and this was a recent change, we recognized that one of the reasons why there were typical road and bridge differences among the districts is just by either the good fortune or bad fortune of the timing of replacing these major bridges. Because it truly, for a 15 to 20 year period, we do an internal borrowing mechanism. So you're paying down essentially the debt from a major bridge, and that's money you don't have for your typical work. So over the course of 15 or 20 years, we had all these debits and credits rolling. It was really complicated, and I think that was an excess burden on the districts, and it created results that were not what we were looking for. So we actively looked at this and said, if we can remove that burden, that's a big deal. And effectively, what the General Assembly has done in the last couple of years with the governor, by taking on major projects on the interstate, that same thing is happening. So the underlying STIP, the basis of the funding, will be more directed at the typical road and bridge work that most people are driving on to and from their homes to their places of work and otherwise. And it's not necessarily the throughput on the national system. That's going to have a tremendous benefit over the next 10 years for the typical road and bridge condition.
So this now gets us down to, and I think Mr. Hegman, you, Commissioner, as you spoke, this gets us down to the factors on how we distribute money. And for asset management, this is where we try to approximate the use of the system and a little bit of the size of the system are the driving factors here. So we're looking at vehicle miles traveled, how much traffic is there, the percent of square feet of bridge deck. We don't do the number of bridges because not all bridges are equal. So we actually do the square feet of bridge deck that people are taking care of. And we also do lane miles on the national highway system and the arterials as the factors that are then proportional. Each district gets a proportional share, right? So what we do is we take up the state's number and then how many are in each district, and you get a percentage that is used. It's run through a spreadsheet as like this, and that turns into a percentage. And we got some graphics that show you how that's distributed here in just a minute. And
we have all the factors are included in your backup as well.
Right.
those change as we're making changes to the system, as populations change and as travel changes. So there's a little bit of a lag on each of those factors. But each year, whatever that lag is, just continues to get updated. So it's not static.
Now, this is also where this asset management grows. It gets more expensive with time, right? So we first do our asset management, taking care of what we have. Money then that's left is what's for system expansion. And this is where then another set of factors are used to allocate it. This is where we bring in population, total employment, and vehicle miles on the national highway system and R2. So this is for expansion. We try to approximate economic activity. That's where employment and population are tried to factor in there. But the thing I'll show out of these, one of the most common questions we get is we don't, and the director mentioned this earlier, we don't do this based on where the gas tax is collected. Most common question when we're out in the public, people want to know, and as director mentioned, it's collected at 22 spots. I looked on the Department of Energy report. Right now there's 4,500 retail fueling stations in Missouri. That's not where the tax is collected. So we don't really know specifically, gas tax generated by district. We can approximate it based on vehicle miles traveled and gas mileage and things like that. But we really know it's collected at those 22 locations. But those 22 locations truck fuel to these 4,500 retail spots. But that doesn't play into this factor. So what we're trying to deal with here in these factors are ones that are publishable, right? They're known information, population, employment. We get those from federal sources. Vehicle miles traveled, we collect that data. And these data's update. This is not static. So it's not like the formula was done one time and it stays that way. So this also addresses the migration within the state and economic activity and population movements within the state as well. So the factors update. That's why you'll see from any given year in the STIP, you'll notice the numbers a little bit different. And that's because of updating the factors or approximating the update of the factors.
And this was, this particular area was of particular discussion and debate for a couple of years in terms of allocation of resources. What ended up happening is the way this formula was written, when we called it taking care of the system, from 2003, an estimate of asset management cost was built in. And then that was adjusted once in 2006 and not again for over a decade. So the total cost allocation was a dollar amount. So we put $435 million into asset management for 12 years with no adjustment for inflation. So the actual price of asset management had more than doubled. And because you're using different factors between the allocation of resources for taking care of the system and for system expansion, that was creating essentially a dislocation of that allocation. So by floating this and using our asset management plan to do the calculation of how much it costs to take care of the system and to enable that to be the allocated amount, I mean, that's a very significant impact. We were able to line this in when resources were growing so that the year that we made the adjustment, even though the allocation between the different districts changed somewhat, everyone received more money compared to the year before when we made the adjustment. There was a bit of controversy with this because there were certainly places that benefited from the economic allocation rather than the size and use calculations. But that's floating it, because what we were doing is we were forcing money on our districts through this allocation, but we were also directing our district engineers to manage their assets on our asset management plan, but they weren't getting the money in proportion to that. So they would have to push money from system expansion back up the waterfall and use it for asset management, but they didn't get the money in the right proportion. So this was a difficult change and a wise one by the commission, but and I think, again, this just helps us kind of equalize the end results as we go. And it shows that this, it shows the difficulty of having something be static and not dealing with it for a while.
So I think, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to me, this is one of the most important decisions that the commission can make.
Yep.
We made this, I mean, Greg
Yep.
left the room, so I'm the only one that was on here, but it was in 2018, but it took 4 years for it to go into effect in
That's right.
2022. And as you said, we were only spending 465 million on taking care of the system. Then it went to 600 and some, and now it's at 706.
And it's,
When we were spending 465 to take care of the system, we only had 125 million for expansion, if I remember correct.
yeah, it was limited.
And so, Northeast and Northwest were having to use all their expansion money to take care of the system.
That's exactly right.
So my question is, safeties went up to 58 million, which that was a commission directed. And we've changed it to where our asset management's going to
It floats.
adjust. But now we're at $1 billion for expansion, correct?
That's right.
I guess the $1 million question to me is, I don't think that 706 million is the correct number to take care of the system and add another $1 billion worth of projects. I mean, that's my gut feeling, but I think that's when I say the most important decision of this commission is that the right number?
Yep.
Because with the way things,
It's
increasing costs and all this stuff, we were at one time only spending $100 million on expansion, and now we're talking about $1 billion, and we're going to have to take care of that expansion.
That's a great
So
point.
Yep.
is $1 billion the appropriate? I mean, that's where I think our discussion needs to take place.
I think the notion here was what we're doing is using an engineering estimate for what it costs to maintain our system at its current condition. That's a key factor. And, with the level of funding, current condition has, over 800 poor condition bridges. So if you want to,
Yeah, we have,
so is the goal of asset management correct based on the funding? I think that is an important
do we need to
consideration.
spend $1 billion on expansion when we have 800 bridges that are in poor condition? Or when we have rural routes that are still at 48% good condition? I mean, to me, that is what we need to be figuring out as a commission.
That's a great point. That's the conversation, though, as Ed mentioned over time, this is facilitated, because that wasn't the conversation before.
Right.
Right. And that's also what's gotten us to the spot we are over time. But making that change to allow asset management to grow, because keep in mind, we're about to redo our long range transportation plan. And every time we've done it, the first thing Missourians tell us when we go out and do the survey, take care of what you got.
Yep.
That's the first thing every time. The second one is make it safe. But every time we've updated it that I've been, those dominate. And this is making sure our money matches to that. I think the other thing to keep in mind, that the operating budget plays a key role in that asset management portion as too. And that's where we haven't been able to add funding to, because some of those key activities that are done on those roads that don't get federal money are done by our operations crews. And they're highly effective, but you got to have money to do the chip seal and things like that in the right time. So it works hand in hand.
The other piece is that in this change, the update on taking care of the system was run at a percent increase, and inflation has gotten beyond that. So I think we're back again at a point where money's being allocated through system improvement. It doesn't mean that we're doing $1 billion in system improvement, because a lot of that gets pushed back up to run asset management based on the increasing costs. So
Yes.
we have to go back and continue to update the assumptions. We have to make certain assumptions just to run a multi-year allocation. but we have to constantly update those assumptions. And I don't think we've really done that in terms of the pricing of the asset management.
Well, it's going to be, I mean, this is where all the consternation comes about because the districts that have maybe less poor bridges or better road condition, they're going to be able to use a lot of that money to expansion. And when you adjust that figure, it takes that money away from them, which
It does.
upsets them
Yes.
Yes.
considerably.
Yeah.
But we as a commissioner are supposed to be looking at the whole picture, not just certain areas.
Right.
Right.
So
That's a great point because, and to Patrick's point, our current STIP is 78% asset management.
Yeah.
That's the one that, not the draft that we're going to bring you, but the one that we're operating in right now. When you take all the projects that are in there, 78%. And is that the right number? That's, that's, as you travel around the state, you hear the region's desires, and very few people come to talk to you about taking care of something we already have. So, but that's as engineers, and our responsibility is to bring you the information to help with that. So, we've really tried to move this to factual, data driven to make good decisions on. And the next piece I would like to talk about, there's a graphic that kind of shows you each district's percentage share of those three funding categories of safety, asset management, and system improvement. So we use those factors to come up with this percentage for each district that then we apply to the money that's available in those categories. So if you take Northwest there on the safety category, they get 6% of the safety dollars. And then the one thing I'll also help you understand is why are there two in Kansas City and two in Southwest? This is where we have to deal with the TMAs, right? So St. Louis has a TMA, but it's the entire district. So the accounting of federal funds and the allocation of funds are used. The TMA covers part of Kansas City.
Can you define TMA for the
Oh.
commission, please?
Yes. So this is the federal designation of our planning partners. So in the rural part of the state, there are regional planning commissions. And in the semi-urbanized, we get the MPOs, and then we get to the larger ones in Kansas City, St. Louis.
And it's based
Springfield.
on population.
And it's population driven.
out of our,
Right.
Yep.
So the agency that you commonly know as MARC. In St. Louis, it's East-West Gateway. And in Springfield, it's OTO. But that's why there's two sets there. It's not that they're doubling up. It's that region actually gets divided geographically of what funds can be used in which region. Adds to the complexity of it, I'll say. Now, I think also in the information, you'll see a breakdown by districts that shows you those percentages, and it gives you 3 years as a STIP. And you'll notice they vary a little bit. That's the updating of the factors of anticipated for traffic and all the other activities that move them a little bit. What we provide to each district when we do this, it's what we call a funding distribution package. It's actually several pages, and it spells out all the factors and the data behind it so they can see what's moving and what's driving which numbers. It's also how we work with our planning partners to help them understand. So as you set this policy and we implement, we also know we work with all of our regional planning partners to understand. They very much get into the details of what makes up that 6%, or what makes up their 9% of the asset management, and what are the actual numbers behind size of system and number of square feet of bridge that drive that. So that's how we're also transparent. That's, the commission policy sets this out. The funding distribution, we show everybody, here's the numbers that go with it. And that's that part of that accountability.
And, Mr. Chairman, just looking at the numbers and commenting on your part, in this period of time that we're talking about, we also offloaded the major bridges. So what would have been from a few years ago, the asset management piece, we pulled all of that out, and that's pretty significant in terms of the
I think the
dollars.
three significant ones that are helping us, and we're going to show you the data that shows we're moving, are that the major bridges coming out, the letting asset management grow, and also the asset management deficit on the operating and this side of targeting money to those specific types of projects that need it. That's moving that needle, and we'll be able to show you those results.
Do we have the updated numbers on where Missouri sits on the amount of capital assets we have in transportation? I mean, a few years ago, that number was what, $160 billion?
Yeah,
Do we have today's?
We look at it in terms of the replacement cost
The replacement
of
cost,
the
that's right.
of the roads and bridges.
Mhm.
And I think we've got that estimated at a replacement cost of about 175 billion
Okay.
today.
So if we look at that and then you go back to what we're putting back into the system every year.
Yeah.
You know, if we look at this big picture, that's the real number.
Yeah.
That's really and truly what we're doing to invest back into the system.
Several years ago, it was 0.3%,
Correct.
and now we're just over 1%.
And 1% is still very low.
It is.
Just to point that out on any type of infrastructure,
Any asset management.
for
Yep.
a long period of time, 1% is very, very low.
Yeah, it's usually 3 to 5.
3 to 5. Yeah. all
Don't
day
use
long.
1% in your asset management class. They're not going to like that.
Now,
Right.
we're very fortunate because if you look at the things that have happened over time, as you
Right.
pointed out, pulling majors out, handling that as a statewide issue, the general revenue that's come in. We've had these opportunities
Yep.
to get at that 1% number and really make, make some
Big strides,
headway
big
on our
strides.
backlog.
Yeah.
I go back to and this team is certainly geared this way, is this opportunity we have in front of us. We have to execute
Right.
relentlessly.
Right.
And that's the key to continuing this trend of moving in the right direction. Because, if you look at this over time, there was a time period where this ship was not sailing in the right direction. Today, we're headed in the right direction. We just have to execute.
But, also looking relatively at the level of funding and determining if our asset management goals continue to line up. I think that's an important consideration for the commission.
Agree.
Because our asset management goals, and that's what cascades into the plans of the districts.
Mhm.
For instance, they're, to keep our interstates and majors in 90% good condition, the arterials in 80%, and our minor roads in 70% condition. Is that the goal that we should have? I think that's central to what the chairman asked about at this level of funding. Acknowledging that if you shift those goals, that consumes very substantial revenue
Yes.
going forward. And the same thing on bridges. If our asset management goals are essentially to not get in worse shape, they don't necessarily solve the problem, but there's never, the right number for asset management on bridges isn't 0 poor condition bridges, because then you're replacing bridges before they've used
That's
their
right.
useful life. For us, it's probably more like 3 to 500, not 8 to 900.
Right.
So maybe there's an asset management goal that should shift that starts bringing that number down over time. That'll consume more of the available resources, and that's a policy consideration, but it might be the right one.
And we have tremendous data to be able to guide that.
That's
So the big thing that, and this is the nerdy engineer part of me coming out, is there's a lot of times a misconception on the degradation of any sort of infrastructure being a straight line.
Right. Yeah.
And it's certainly not. I mean, there comes a point within that if you go another year,
There's a point where you can save it,
Yeah.
and there's a point where you can't.
that's right. If you go another year, it may cost 2, 3, 4
Particularly
times
with
to fix it.
pavement. You've got a declination curve that is exponential.
That's right.
So it takes, it's a gradual move from good to fair condition, and it's a sudden drop off from fair to poor. And it makes sense, right? You think of your own driveway, you get cracks in it, you don't take care of that, water gets in, breaks things apart, it freezes, and then you've got to replace the whole thing. So a lot of people get upset with our pavement programs in terms of how much money we spend on pavement, but keeping the interstates, keep in mind, all the debt from the early 2000s was because we were expanding the system, not keeping up with the pavements on the interstate, and the pavement condition on average was only 40% good condition. that is a massive, massive cost. And I think when I talk to Eric and Ed about concerns, and districts talk about concerns on asset management, they think about the typical pavement condition on interstates as being, right, probably second after bridge condition as the primary financial concern. And if we, because we're seeing that's ticked down a couple percent in terms of our condition. That a couple percent down on interstates is a heck of a lot more money than 5% up on minor roads. So, just the scale of what we're dealing with and the costs per mile, it is really complicated. And sometimes you don't get it perfectly right, or you just have conditions with weather that change the conditions dramatically, and then you have to respond.
So I'll kind of wrap up with one thing. My voice is going here. A table that shows you 1 year of all those funds and a 5-year average.
Yeah, and I'll give you a break, Eric. So this is part of what we put in our citizens guide as well. So regardless of, and what you'll see is sometimes, this is the entire construction program and the way it's allocated, our operating budget, administrative costs, and our highway safety programs with the totals. So this is the result of all the allocations, and you see the distribution of financial activity through the project and operating costs. This was not an easy exercise for the enterprise several years ago. It is really important. And we tried to go back 10 years, but we used to have 10 districts also. So we really couldn't do that reasonably well. So we've been building to this 5-year look back over the course of the last couple of years. I think the team has done a really outstanding job of doing this, but this is really what it's all about. And you can see that these allocations are working and money is flowing through them.
Anybody have any questions for Eric? Lauren?
Yeah. Clearly, this allocation issue is one that we hear a lot about, one that there's a lot of interest and maybe misunderstanding about, for sure. And so it's good that we understand it, and equally clear, it's very complicated. And so I sit here and listen today and I try to come up with an elevator speech that can summarize it accurately, conceptually, so that when you run into people, you can kind of explain it in a moment or two and it's understandable. So I'm going to rehearse that on you. So we start by deducting all of the pass-throughs and what I would call earmarked obligations that are earmarked or a pass-through for specific things that we have no discretion over. And then we deduct everything else listed in steps through 9, which include, I'm going to just broadly call them earmarks, open container,
Same thing. Yeah.
cost share, all
have
of
rules.
debt service. I think people would understand that you got to take all that, you got to pay your debt service. I suppose of those, cost share might be somewhat discretionary, but I'm a big fan of that one. Big fan of that one. And when you do all that, as well as the constitutional deductions to Highway Patrol, Department of Revenue, et cetera, that leaves you with an amount of money that then you can budget in the STIP. What at the railroad we would think of as maybe our capital budget, although it includes asset management. And so then we, based on safety statistics, we take off the top of that where we believe safety is at most at risk. We try to solve the worst things first, and we take that off. And then we're left with asset management. And if I understand that right, that is primarily driven by percent of total vehicle miles traveled, percent of square feet of state bridge decks, and percent of total lane miles on the national highway system. So now we're really getting down to the bottom here. And then based on those factors, money gets allocated out And that's where all the consternation comes, is where that goes. But it's based on those things, safety and those three criteria. And then when we get done with all that, we're finally left with what's left for expansion, which I would share the chairman's notion that I wonder if it's time to maybe re-examine how much we put toward asset management. I would add to that operations. I think we've starved operations over a period of time and would like to see us rethink about operations. And I know you're going to talk about that. But generally, that's kind of the way I see it. Have I missed the mark here?
You're very, very good.
Yeah, I think we look at it as it's a waterfall, right?
Yeah.
So there's an amount of money coming into the top of the waterfall, and each little step along the way pulls resources out. What is at the bottom of the waterfall is expansion.
Yeah. So the chairman raises the question is, where we are today at the bottom of the waterfall, is that really where we ought to be?
Sure.
And I think operations is a big part of asset management.
Sure.
I've always
Yep.
believed
It
that.
is.
Yeah,
So
and
when we
clearly
talk
is.
about increasing asset management, in my mind, that includes customer service for operations.
Well, and it also includes the maintenance and preservation of the minor road system. That is part of our operating
Yeah.
budget. So it does not get distributed through the funding allocation because it's not in some cases, not on the national highway system.
If you
at the
increase
lower volume.
operations funding, you increase that.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm going to add that in Patrick's description of the waterfall continues on.
Yep.
The staff takes care of however the waterfall is going to operate based
Yep.
on what the parameters are.
Right.
And my observation is that prior to Patrick's getting here, and I'm going to give the commission a little bit of credit, there was no adjustment change. It was just
Right.
the waterfall was taking place and that's the way it was.
Yep.
Yes.
It's imperative now that, we understand how it works and that we make the decisions as a commission. I keep saying that.
Yeah.
What's the right numbers? Because like Warren says, operating, we're deficit net, taking care of the system. Is that enough? I mean,
This is dynamic enough to consider results now,
Right.
whereas before it didn't.
Right.
It was, well, this is how it's done, this is how it's written, and therefore that's how it shall be. This is more dynamic than that, and it
And it's
needed
hard.
to be.
it's not,
It's
I'm just trying to express to the commission, it's not the staff's job to figure that out. It's our job.
And-
yeah, and on the operating side, there is an additional element. at
That's the
play.
point I was just going to
An
make.
additional element is from the very first, that snake that we ran you through, that 18-month cycle, year in and year out, we have, at the commission's instruction, attempted to better resource our operations, and it doesn't make it through the budget process. Although we never bring you an operating budget or a capital budget request over a 5-year period that our estimate of revenue doesn't cover. So that is the taxpayer money that comes in for this special purpose, for what we do. We never have brought you, in my tenure, and I would say in Brenda's tenure and way back, this department at the commission's instruction has never brought you a budget that exceeds our resources that the taxpayers provide through the policy process. We don't do that. So it is really frustrating for us in the public process that when we want to improve customer service and when we ask for the staff and the equipment to do it, it doesn't make it through the legislative budget process. Although different than a general revenue request, we're not asking the General Assembly to bring more money in that case. We're just saying this is the right split of the money that exists at the commission's instruction, and that doesn't make it through because it's a different type of budget, and it doesn't fit really well. And that's where the constraints on this operating capacity come from.
So in short, there's an additional obstacle to getting operations where it needs to be, and it is a presumption or a bias in the General Assembly against increasing headcount.
Yeah, that's part of it.
That's kind of the bottom line.
Or
Or
equipment.
And equipment.
Head count and equipment.
Yes.
Or that.
That's right.
Or
Because
that.
And we're how many days are we into our are trying to figure out a determination of what the Constitution says? I mean,
I think today
400.
started into years.
yeah.
450, something like that.
Any other questions for Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
Great
you.
presentation.
That's really, again, I think I want to thank Pam Harlan and all the staff who've put this together, but just to, again, to bring it forward and to make it a priority. I think from a public meeting perspective, it had been nearly a decade probably since this had been done. So appreciate that that's the case. And again, that basic construct that in the enterprise itself, the department executes commission policy. That is our task. And the commission's policy is the commission's policy. Now, you've asked us on many occasions to look at things differently and to bring recommendations for modifications. That happens as a matter of course. We continue to do that. And I think that's important to continue to do that so that we don't make an assumption on how things are today from a standpoint that they can't change. That's an important thing. You get baked into these decisions and we look at it and say, okay, the allocation that we've made right now is baked in for the next 3 years. And that's how we fulfill our construction commitments and how we proceed and how we're able to execute the plan. But that does not mean that it cannot be modified. And you can see just in the footnotes of that funding allocation policy, it's more routine that it changes than it doesn't. And that's the piece. There is capability to modify as conditions warrant, and to consider very carefully what that means. And in many cases, the commission will ask for an assessment of a change, look at the resulting data, and find that maybe that isn't the right thing to do at the time. So it's an iterative process where we are at your service to do those types of things, to create those types of analysis, and to continue to make the system with the limited resources and the constraints that we have the best it possibly can be. And the results where we are a large system nationwide, one of the lowest funded, but we are not one of the worst conditioned systems. So that is the result of the staff work and the dedication and also the execution on the private sector. We get good value from our contractors in this state, and we're lucky that we do. So,
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just make a comment if I could, please. First of all, I just want to thank Patrick and Ed and Eric and the entire team. This was very, very informative presentation for me as a relatively newly appointed commissioner. It's obvious that you're all very talented, but you articulated what you do, and provided me, and I know the entire board, with information that's very important to the work we do as well. And it really showcased the talent, the commitment, and the professionalism that you all have. And I just want to thank you for this presentation. This was very helpful. Great. Thank you.
welcome.
Yeah, I just want to, in closing, thank the staff for all the work you did to put this together. Very informative. And being the oldest member on the commission, I know that some of you are faster learners than me, but finally, after all these years and hearing this 2 or 3 times, is you finally get a grasp of exactly how. I mean, the first time you hear it, it's like taking information in a fire hose. I mean, so it's. I'm glad we did this, and I appreciate the time that the commission allowed this to happen, and the questions that you asked. There's never a wrong question. Don't ever feel like you can't ask a question, because that's what we're here for. And just we need to continue refresh our memories on this stuff on maybe a routine basis schedule. So anything else?
Nothing further.
At this time, we're going to take a recess for a lunch break. We will reconvene at 1 p.m., whereupon we will enter into our closed meeting. We are recessed.